Autumn Brown, front woman of the eponymously named soul pop band Autumn, a queer science fiction writer, a theologian, a mother of dragons, and a healing justice facilitator for social movements living on Dakota and Anishinaabe land currently known as Minneapolis.
And I'm Adrienne Marie Brown, a luscious Black queer witch writer auntie, an apocalyptic cosmic optimist, and a gardener of healing ideas. I live in the land of the Shikori, Squirure, Tuscarora, and Lumbee peoples known as Durham.
And this is How to Survive the End of the World,
our podcast about learning from apocalypse with grace, rigor, and curiosity.
As a reminder, we still are ad-free. We are fully listener-supported.
So join our Patreon for exclusive, hot tea, delicious, intimate content. I'm making it sound like our Patreon is like our OnlyFans or something.
It is kind of like an OnlyFans, except the thing that's on display is like our vulnerability. Exactly.
It's like, I was crying on there, so that's where you should go see that. Now, I'm so geeked out about who our guest is today. She's a beloved of a beloved, and so she's someone who I keep tabs on through the network of friendship, and someone who I deeply, deeply admire and look up to as a writer and a scholar. Today, we have Eve L. Ewing as a writer, scholar, and cultural organizer joining us from Chicago. She is the author of the books Original Sins, Electric Arches, Ghosts in the Schoolyard, 1919, and Maya and the Robot, which
I have a copy of.
Children's book. She writes comic books, including Exceptional X-Men, yes, those X-Men, and Ironheart, and Black Panther.
What?
And TV, and theater, and a lot of other things as well. Eve is an associate professor in the Department of Race, Diaspora, and Indigeneity at the University of Chicago. We should check and see if that's still going to get to exist, where she teaches courses on education and racial equality and directs the Beyond Schools Lab. Dr. Ewing is also a cultural organizer, which means she works collectively with other people to build and nurture creative communities and strive for social transformation through artistic and cultural practices. Even though these things are listed separately here, that's on her website, they all live jumbled up together in her head and her heart.
Aww.
Yay. So Eve, welcome to How to Survive the End of the World podcast. We always start off by just asking, how are you today on the clock of the world?
Oh, yeah. Thank you for asking that. One of the most Midwestern things about me is that like all conversations begin with the weather. And so,
absolutely.
So I'm pretty good because it's been really like frigid. And yesterday was like super comically icy here. There was a very viral video of a cop that like slipped on the ice and just was like all the way like just laid out. It was like very, very, very icy, like skating, like little penguin gif ice. And so today is not that. So that's clutch. And then another thing is that I've been having I just finished a really good teaching week in what has been a really good teaching term for me. Like I am like really euphoric off of my teaching practice right now.
What makes a good teaching week?
What makes a good teaching week? I think, you know what it is? So I'm teaching 2 classes right now. One is called Race in American Public Schools, and it's like kind of, it's very intimately related to the book that we're going to talk about. And but this year, for the first time, I've taught this class in many different iterations for many years, but I've always wanted part of it to be a collaboration with some local public school students. And but I wanted to like really get the class right first because I didn't want to be like bringing somebody else's, space into my like messy space. And so I taught the class for several years and I feel like I got good at like, okay, I like this material, I like this approach. And then I have been building a relationship with a teacher in my community that I really like and trust over the past like 5 years. And so we got to a point where we're like, okay, now let's do this collab. And it's really cool. This is like very like, emergent strategy informed in the sense of like moving at the speed of trust. So like 8 years into it, I'm like, okay, now like the class check, the relationship check, so that the only variable is the collaboration. So the collaboration itself gets a lot of attention and nurturing.
Yeah.
And it's going it's going way better than I would have expected for a first run through. And I love seeing the students care for each other. I love seeing the college students care for the high school students. I love hearing them. I love hearing everybody be like a teacher and a learner. I just am am loving it. And then I'm also teaching this Afrofuturisms class, which has the obnoxious academic thing of being like, it's not called Afrofuturism. The class is called Afrofuturisms, and the S is in parentheses. Because it is about the multitudinous visions of what Afrofuturism is, has been, or could be, you know.
I love it.
And that's also just really lovely. And everybody is like just really into it. It's a class that meets in the evening, and half the people. Sorry, you asked me. I'm like hella long-winded, so this is great. I will wrap this up soon. Okay,
that's great. That's great for an interview.
Okay, good.
Podcasters tend to be long-winded people who are just like, no one in my life will listen to me enough, so I'm making a podcast.
Fair enough. But I'll wrap it up quickly. But I'll say that so this class is it's half University of Chicago students and half members of the community, who then also obviously are University of Chicago students because they're in the class together, and the students are also members of the community. But to the degree that dichotomy means something, that's the composition of the class. So we meet in the evenings after work, and we have dinner, and everybody is just like so down and so into it and into each other and like open-hearted and like curious, and they're just so fun and lovely. It's actually a problem because the class is 3 hours and it meets at night, and then when it's over they won't go home. And I'm always like, this has been a delight. Also
I'll see you later.
Please leave.
Talk amongst
like once
yourselves.
I've like cleaned up, like everyone take like 20 minutes after, I'm like, all right, the food is cleaned up, we're all good to go. Like, let's reconvene again next week, same bat time, same bat channel. But yeah, that's for me, like what I strive for I see part of being a teacher fundamentally as like being a community keeper and community builder. It's like you're the designated person who's in charge of stewardship of the space and bringing other people into stewardship of the space. And so when I see people being really good stewards of the community, that's like my teaching euphoria. That's where I'm just like really high off that.
I love that. It sounds so like you're creating a space that feels like utopian medicine, to
I hope so. This week our theme in Afrofuturism was utopias, dystopias. So I've been talking about utopia all week. Yeah.
So fun.
I want to take that class now. Autumn, how are you doing, my love?
I'm also flying off of a euphoric experience. Last night I got to moderate the book release event for my friend Ricardo Levins-Morales, who just published. He's my friend.
He's your friend and he's my associate? What?
Our friend Ricardo wrote a book, and it came out. It's called The Land Knows the Way. The event last night was so beautiful. It was hosted at my favorite local bookstore, Moon Palace Books, here in Minneapolis. And it was standing room only. Like literally, there were so many people that came that we just not only couldn't seat everybody, but couldn't even get everyone in the room. So there was like a crowd of people just like flowing out the hallway, standing in the hallway, just listening, soaking up Ricardo's wisdom. And this is his first book, and which meant it was also his first ever book release event. And first ever time reading from his work in public. And, and he's an elder. And so it was just very tender and very beautiful. And he's just so brilliant and so wise. Yeah. And folks were, you could really feel in the room how raw the moment is for everybody and how ready folks are for some other way of orienting to the time that we are in. Yes. And so the questions that people asked by and large really came from a different place than what I typically experience in those environments. I just could feel this sort of sense of we are undefended in this moment because we need to be listening for something else. Yes. And it was really cool. My kids came with me to the event, which was it was hilarious. And they were by and large pretty patient about being in the space / not being in the space. And one of them stayed in the room the whole time. The others just like were in the the actual bookstore, just like lying on the ground, reading books and just chilling out. Which meant that as soon as the event was over, despite the fact that I wanted to just like stay in the social experience with everyone, I had to peace out. But even that was kind of sweet too, because then I just got to go right into dinner and just being with my kids. And it felt it's been a while since I've gotten to bring my kids into a community event setting like that. And it felt really that there was a sweetness to that, because I used to have them with me in event spaces all the time. And so I'm here at the end of this first week of February with, this week held a lot of unexpected sweetness in my personal life. A lot of just lovely, very connected sweetness, despite all of the awful external conditions in the world. So I'm just feeling a lot of gratitude here at the end of the week, and grateful to get to be in this conversation with you, Eve.
I love that.
How are you, sister?
Now
that it's your turn to check in.
Now that it's finally my turn. It's my turn. I mean, clearly I'm excited to talk with everyone today. And I'm feeling very like loosey-goosey, actually. I've been feeling very kind of soft and discombobulated. I'm in that perimenopausal phase where the period comes kind of whenever it wants to. And it means that the hormonal balance and imbalance is all wild. And so I keep having these moments of observing myself and being like, wow, you're reacting really strongly to that. Is that... does that actually matter at all to you? Because you're really, there's a lot happening in your response. And so I just have to keep kind of discerning back to like, what else could be going on right now? And almost always that answer leads back to like, oh, there's a disturbance in the force. Like there's a disturbance in the collective. And my art and my spiritual practice and my way of being is to be tied into that collective energy. And so I can feel the chaos, the terror, like all this stuff. It's just like floating under the surface. And I'm trying to remember in 2017, like, how did I get under that? Like, what did I do? The same thing happened of like this onslaught of, stuff that doesn't make any sense. And then feeling like, okay, I've got to live through this. How am I going to live through this? And so this week I started to feel like, how little green shoots come up in the spring and they're like, pushing up. I felt like shoots going down through the chaos, reaching the ground this week. I'm like, oh, my roots are finally getting back down to some earth. But I'm not quite, it's like still wobbly. I'm not quite fully tethered yet, but I'm getting there. And the things that are really tethering me right now, I'm like really sifting through the news, trying to find acts of resistance, acts of people standing up, acts of people actually doing their jobs, right? I keep noticing this. I'm like, lawyers, like there's some of this stuff is out of my hands now. So lawyers, y'all have to do your lawyer thing. And Congress people, you have to do your Congress people thing. And like, I was like, and what I get to do is call the government every day and just be on this phone line being like, I'm really upset about this thing. I'm really upset about this thing. And just being like, oh yeah, I'm a citizen. I'm an artist, but I'm a citizen. And like, so I can feel all of that happening. We had 3 balmy days here that felt like spring. And that also felt like a nice, I was like, oh yeah, that will happen again.
Yeah.
Like, spring will come again. All right. So I'm excited to get into this book. The book that we're discussing, you're going to want this book. It's called Original Sins: The Miseducation of Black and Native Children and the Construction of American Racism. And we are focused this season on solidarity. One of the reasons we were excited to invite you on, especially once we saw this book, is that you're exploring the shared history of Black and Indigenous miseducation. And I actually wanted to read a little snippet from it.
Oh, great. I get to hear you read it. That's fun.
Yeah. So this is in the introduction, and it says, for Black and Indigenous people, having to tell and retell stories of suffering can itself feel like an act of violence for the speaker as well as for listeners who may be all too familiar with these stories because they have lived them. But I hope this book is an interruption, not a repetition. I'm not sharing these stories in the hopes of garnering sympathy from those who have inherited the legacies of violence. I'm not sharing them to grant absolution. I share them in the hopes that they will inspire mutual recognition in Black people and Native people, points of departure for our shared conspiring, for our shared flourishing. And I love that as like a boom. This is where we're trying to orient ourselves to. But first, we're going to go back through this history. So I wanted to ask you to tell us a little bit about when you started to see this connected wound and what inspired this text.
Yeah, thank you for that. I love hearing other people read aloud, and I love reading aloud. So that's really the best. So this book is really born out of my own experiences as a teacher, as a student, as a professor. And so, as Black people, speaking for myself at least, like a lot of us are raised with the idea that education is liberation, education is freedom, they can never take your education away from you. The idea of enslaved people writing themselves to freedom, reading themselves into freedom. I remember, this is going to sound very, very dramatic, but the moment when I finished my dissertation, I immediately thought of my enslaved ancestors and I started crying, right? Just every time I see a Black child learn to write their own name for the first time, right? I weep for that. I weep with joy for that. So, that's kind of the relationship to education with which I was raised. And at the same time, schooling, right? I witnessed the many ways that schooling was unequal and harmful, especially to Black people growing up, right? And, to people in my family, to people in my community, to people in my own classroom. And so I always had that kind of tension at the back of my mind. And then when I was becoming a public school teacher myself, and I started learning more about the history of education, I remember reading, I remember where I was the first time that I read quotations from people like Carl Schurz, people like Meryl Edwards Gates, like people that I quote in the book, where they said in no uncertain terms, the most efficient thing is for us to use schools to win, what they referred to as the Indian War. That this is the way, this is more efficient than sending soldiers and armies and people to die. We can, and I mean literally like dollars and cents, like we've calculated that we can spend this much less money if we take people's children away and use that to win the war. And I think that the reason that was so stunning for me is that, and opportunities to engage with archives are really important because you get to hear what people said themselves and, in their own words. And I think that I obviously knew at that point in my life, I knew some things about Native history in the United States and the history of genocide against Indigenous peoples here and across the globe. But I think that I thought that, I was just surprised to hear people say these things in print. Right. And that was a kind of naivete that I held. And so from that point on, when I was teaching about education, after I left the K-12 classroom and, moved into academia and was teaching about schools, I really felt very strongly that I had to begin this history for my students in understanding what schools have meant for Black people and understanding what schools have meant for Native people, because I felt strongly you don't understand schools if you don't understand that. And you actually kind of don't really understand the United States if you don't understand that, I became convinced of that. And so that, those sections on my syllabus would be titled Original Sins.
Yeah.
And I think that, I was thinking about that at the time really from that academic historical perspective. And then through my own always evolving, always deepening kind of Black feminist practice and reading and learning more about Indigenous feminisms, relationships with Indigenous friends, really, and the kind of ongoing political exigencies of the accumulating moments in which we found ourselves, right? And you can say date it however you want, right? Like 2014, 2016, 2020, really just felt like this place has to be a point of departure, not only for kind of a depth of theoretical understanding, but what does it mean for this to be a place of departure for relationship and for organizing? And, how do we come to understand each other? I think one other thing I'll mention is that in the academic world, there's a certain intellectual thread of history that says that Native studies and Black studies are incommensurate. That's the word that's often used, incommensurability. And what people mean by that is that if you're an academic and you've staked your whole claim on the idea that anti-Blackness is the one thing that governs the entire world, and that's how it is, It's not up for discussion. It's not up for debate. And the absolute worst thing that ever happened in the United States was chattel slavery. And there's somebody else who says anti-indigeneity, settler colonialism governs the entire world. That's the original primacy, axiom of the, primal axiom of all of human existence. And if academics are often incentivized to make kind of inflexible, totalizing explanations of things, right? And so if you have these two different sets of people, sets of thinkers, and they're literally like publishing articles and books and like taking shots at each other, I understood those theoretical perspectives, and I was like, from an organizing perspective, that doesn't work for me, right? Like that can't,
that's right.
I can't really do anything with that. And the idea of the most important task being like figuring out who's right about which horrible fundamental disrespect of human life is like worse is not it for me, right? I mean that with all respect to many people who have been in this work for many years and who have written things that I often really respect and have learned from. But for me, and maybe this comes from my orientation of both like being a Chicagoan, being in community, and then also being a teacher, I'm always kind of like, all right, what are we going to do to save each other and ourselves, right? Like, and if you think about this, from like a deep 2020 lens where it's just like this moment of absolute crisis and this question of how we can learn to lean on each other, how we can learn to trust each other becomes so, always crucial, but crucial in more highly visible and like seemingly urgent ways. It's just like all those things led me to say, where do we build together? And with this at the same time, that knowing that building has to come from understanding and learning and hard conversations. It can't come from glossing over moments of dissent or disagreement or, even animosity. So that's kind of like the philosophical project from which the book begins is like very much actually a practical project.
Yes.
Amazing.
I love that.
Amazing. Well, and it makes so much sense to Eve, what you're describing, the incommensurability, the way that that's built into the academic system is obviously mirrored in what your research is about, right? That's all that.
Yeah, it's competition.
All by design.
Right.
To keep people from, being in solidarity with one another.
Right.
And so where we want to go next is to have you kind of break it down for us in terms of what you found in your research. So you say school for white people is about making citizens. School for black people is about saviorism and social control. And school for indigenous people is disappearance by design. So following your order, we wanted to ask some questions about in that, about
Great.
white folks' education, black folks' education, indigenous education. Can you speak about the education that white people are receiving, what they're trained to think about black and indigenous people and other people of color, and whether that education or what role that education plays in the ways that white people grasp onto and really hold on to superiority thinking, even after they're in relationship with people of color?
Yeah. Oh, boy, that was like 3 great questions rolled into each other. Well, one thing I'll do really quickly is one thing that you might hear me say that maybe sounds like annoying or jargony, but for me is kind of an important distinction is I often say school or even like schooling systems or systems of schooling where other people might say education. And we can almost, for those of your listeners that have heard you talk a lot about abolition, right, we might see this as it's almost analogous to people in the abolition space who say like policing or systems of policing or the criminal legal system as opposed to just like police, right? And the reason I want to make that distinction is because education is always beautiful, right? Education is a thing that all human beings have engaged in since the beginning of time, right? When your grandmother taught you how to make sweet potato pie, when you taught yourself how to fish, right? When you see a child like try to get their thumb in their mouth and then they don't and then they do, right? All those things are education. Education is sacred. Education is beautiful. And school spaces are institutionally governed spaces where the claim is that education is happening, and sometimes it is, and sometimes it isn't. And sometimes school is actually like fundamentally focused on eroding education, right? Stopping education, eliminating education. So I think going from there, the history that I kind of begin with in the book and bifurcating, well, I guess not bifurcating because there's three, trifurcating? No.
Hey, go for it.
That kind of tripartite, formulation is that, schools for white people and the way we think about schools, especially from a historical framework, has always been understood to be about making these good citizens of the Republic, right? Now, what that means has meant different things at different times in history for different people. And I think that this is the part of the book that a lot of people really geek out over, because part of what I talk about is how things that we take for granted as kind of everyday fabric of the social world of schools, things like recess, things like kindergarten, things like the Pledge of Allegiance, things like what you eat in the cafeteria at lunch, that all of those things come from very intentional efforts to create a unified citizenry at the time, at the beginning of the 20th century, when there was a huge influx of immigrants that we now would consider white, but at the time were not white people, right? People from Southern Europe, people from Eastern Europe. And, there are things like teaching kids how to play certain games together at recess in kindergarten were intentionally designed to, help those kids assimilate and to tell them, like, your ethnic background that you've brought here, forget about that. Like, you are an American now. And that's the kind of thing that, in knowing that I wanted to write about this, my paranoia is that people are going to be like, well, you just made that up, or you're reading too much into it. And so that's why the book has so many citations, because I'm like, no, I have a quote from the guy who opened the first kindergarten, who I have a passage from the kindergarten journal, right? Where, these folks in the archives are saying things like, kindergarten is great because when kids play together at recess, they will forget if they are Italian or if they are Jewish. Like, within a week, they will all just be citizens of the playground. Like, these are things that people said on, I have mad receipts on this, And so, similar, like, another story is like the cafeteria food, and that the origins of cafeteria food and home economics was really partially because there were these social reformers, like, benevolent white women, social reformers, that really felt like we need to teach them how to eat, good, nutritious American food and not all this stuff with like seasoning and garlic and flavor, right? We need to get rid of that. And so, they literally served kids cafeteria food to kind of give them a taste and say they're going to go home and teach their parents, if they take home ec, they're going to go home and teach their parents how to make, like clam chowder and things like that, like bland. I mean, I love a good clam chowder. I'm not here to slander clam chowder.
A good one is different than a bland one.
Yeah, than a bland one. Unseasoned clam milk. And
no.
So that's kind of the story of schooling for white people. And I will say that for me, as somebody, like when I got my first master's degree, when I got licensed to become a teacher, and you learn about the history of schools, that's kind of like the idea that schools are to make everybody a citizen and help everybody work together. That was kind of like the party line, right? And there might sometimes be a footnote or a chapter or a week in the syllabus that was like, oh, also not for these people though, not for Mexican people, not for Asian people, not for Black people, not for Latin, right? And so, so I think that part of what I'm trying to say here is that it's important to tell that story, but I want people to understand it as like also a racialized project, right? Mm-hmm. That it's also a project that is creating whiteness. It's not like that's the regular story and everybody else's story is like deviant or on the margins. This is also part of a racial project.
Right.
Yeah. I think that's so important, that piece around visibilizing whiteness and being like, whiteness is as constructed as any other racial construction, and it's socialized in this way and normalized in this way. So that's kind of the schooling of white folks. So then can you speak to the similarities and differences in the schooling for Black and Indigenous peoples?
Sure. So for Black people, one of the most massive and socially important education, schooling efforts in the history of the United States, which actually, by the way, also had a huge influence on just like the notion of public common schooling in general, is the schooling of newly emancipated freed people after the formal end of slavery. And so I really appreciate writing about that time because, again, there's this incredible archival set of texts. And one of the things I like to quote from are the textbooks that were given to Black people during this time. And really the message was, at all costs, no matter what, it is your job to be subservient. It is your job to be happy. It is your job to never complain. It is your job to never raise your hand in vengeance, no matter what, and to work as hard as you possibly can, right? For us.
Yep.
And if you think about that, think about the kind of urgent need for social control that you would see in a time when there are all these newly freed Black people in a way that was, you know, frankly terrifying for a lot of folks in the class of the powerful. And terrifying not only because these Black people could raise their hands in vengeance against those that grievously harmed them, but also because it's like, okay, they don't got to work for us no more. So how are we going to coerce people through, you know, tenant farming, through, you know, convict leasing, through whatever way we can to continue to get coerced or forced labor out of them? And so there are these amazing quotations from, you know, I quote extensively from Lydia Child, who's a kind of famous and very respected abolitionist. And she wrote these textbooks where she gave these, what she called counsels for freed people. And she talked about how, you know, there's this passage where she's like, you know, Black women, if your master abuses you or assaults you, say like, hey, I'm free now and I have dignity and I'm a good woman. You can't do that to me. And, you know, if they don't believe you, then, you know, call the authorities. And if the authorities don't help you, write your congressperson. But whatever you do, no matter what, even if they, and she says this specifically, even if they abuse your children, do not ever raise your hand against them, right? And first of all, the comedy of telling somebody in the Reconstruction era, like, yeah, if your former slave master is mean to you, like write a firmly worded letter to your congressperson. But if you think about it, like what is the fear here, right? The fear is, oh, these people are going to turn around and do to us what we did to them. And if they do even a fraction of it, that idea is so horrifying, so terrifying that they would treat our children or treat us the way we treated their children, you know? And so, so this message of subservience became really, really important. And again, it's not subtle. It's not like, you know, and she has these stories about, like, here's some famous Black people in history and famous freedom fighters you should know about. And she writes about Toussaint Louverture, and she's like, he was very happy and lived like a peaceful and calm life and loved everybody. It's like, okay. And then there's another part like a favorite part where she talks about John Brown. And she's like, John Brown is an important hero of the Republic. And the story she tells of John Brown is that when he was on his way to the gallows, he saw this sweet little child and they exchanged this like moment of tenderness. And it was almost like Jesus being taken to the cross to be crucified. And she doesn't say like why he was going to the gallows or what he did. It's like, no, because he led a violent slave rebellion.
Insurrection.
Right? Like he led an insurrection. And so, but no, the whole story of John Brown, it's like when I showed my niece The Lion King for the first time and I freaked out and like lost my nerve and fast forward everything. So I was like, she thinks The Lion King is a movie about a baby named Simba that wants to be king. And then he meets his friends Timon and Pumbaa, and then the movie ends. That's it. That's it. Whole movie, 15 minutes long. That's all, you know. Hakuna Matata, and then him and Nala. Then it rains, and then the movie ended, right?
Yeah.
And so, like, that's the version. And it's just so obvious, you know, that like, and it's bold. Like it's laughable. It's laughably bold. And to get to the final part of your question, for Indigenous peoples, you know, as we know, right, this country persists on stolen land, and not just the act of the land theft that is fundamental to the architecture of the country, but the violence that urged along the land theft, the violence that was necessitated by the land theft. And that's an ongoing project, right? The ongoing project of violence, the ongoing project of disappearance. And so going back to Thomas Jefferson and other thinkers of his time, there's this narrative that Native people in the United States were always doomed to disappear, right? Like it was just their destiny. It was just their lot in life to go away.
Fascinating.
And we see that even in contemporary ways that people teach and learn about Native people in K-12 settings now. And so how many kids do you know, and maybe you all when you were in school, where the way Native people were talked about in schools is always the past tense, right? Like the natives did this, right? The Indians here did this. And you know, and if you're going to learn about them, you're going to learn about like how they lived in the 1800s. And you know, I've heard people say, I literally did not know that there were Native people continuing to live in the U.S. And I remember this has gotten out of favor now, thankfully, as I think people have gotten, a little bit more knowledge. But I remember like maybe 15 years ago on Facebook, I remember so many people that identified as being leftists or, people with kind of radical racial politics. And on Columbus Day or on Thanksgiving, they would kind of post something that was sort of snarky, and they'd say something like, I don't celebrate this day because, this is when we took all the land and this country killed all the natives, right? And there's kind of a glibness to that is supposed to be offering a critique of those holidays, but it's also like there are Native people living, right? And so the conversation of disappearance, as though it's kind of a fait accompli, is really goes unexamined in a lot of classrooms. And so we see that as well, of course, with the most obvious example being the horrific violent legacy of residential schools, of boarding schools, where Native kids were taken from their families, sent away, and, forbidden from speaking their language, forbidden from practicing their religion, often, very brutally, very violently treated. I'm always hesitant to talk about this because this is not my history, right? And so I don't want to just reinscribe trauma for people for whom it is their history, but it is our history. It's collective history of this country. And so, that is also a form of disappearance, and it manifests today in so many different ways, even down to the erasure of Native people from conversations about race, right? And so, in the education world, there's a whole book called Beyond the Asterisk that's written by a collective of Native educators talking about how many times do you see a bunch of education data and then there's an asterisk next to Native people, like not enough data, right? So it's like you don't even exist within this conversation in the curriculum, in the stories that we tell. And so, that's the not so quick version of a long book.
Yes.
Yeah, I have to say I really appreciate the foundation, like the levels of it, because it's so easy. The way you write makes things feel so accessible, even though it's really big ideas and big history you're dealing with. But I feel like so much of it is like, I can easily understand how from this history we end up with the educational crisis that we're in today.
Thank you. That means a lot to hear.
Yeah.
Wow. I'm wondering if from here, thank you so much for that eloquent explanation. I'm wondering if from here you can connect the dots for us and our listeners between this schooling process, as you call it, and our carceral system, and how people are criminalized particularly when they begin to resist schooling.
Yes. Thank you so much for that. A lot of people are familiar with the phrase school to prison pipeline, and there are a lot of scholars, one of whom I'll shout out, whose name is Erica Miners, here in Chicago, who talk instead about a school-prison nexus. And what they mean by that is the idea that the logics of carcerality, the logics of the prison, the logics of policing structure the experiences for many young people in schools, whether or not they ever get arrested, whether or not they ever encounter a police officer, right? Certainly whether or not they actually end up at the end of that pipeline. And so thinking about schools less as schools are here, prison is here, and we're being shuttled from one to the other, but instead asking where are those carceral logics really baked into the fabric of the everyday, and for whom? And one of the arguments that I make is that a basic underpinning logic of American schooling has been the idea that Black people's bodies and Native people's bodies require control, require intensive surveillance, require a kind of withering of autonomy. And it's for everybody's safety. It's for the best, right? And that is, there are places in this book where we see our histories come together and places where they diverge. But I think that need for bodily control is one of the places where it's really important for us to learn and build from each other. Quick note about the each other part of that, just to put an asterisk in this conversation, is I also don't want to engage in the erasure of Black Indigenous people, of whom there are many, right? And so that's its own kind of intersectional conversation that's also really important. So I apologize if I'm kind of using that gloss in a rapid fire way, but not in a way that I hope erases those people's experiences and identities. But so, one example is really thinking about the ways that punishment, I talk about this phrase that I heard a lot when I was a teacher, which is like, well, some kids need that, right? Some kids just need that. Well, these things, you wouldn't want that done to your kid or somebody in your community, but some kids need that. And I talk about a personal story that I experienced, which is that when I was an 8th grade teacher, I found out kind of midway through the year that there was going to be a field trip to the Cook County Jail, and that I taught in a basically all black school. I think this particular year there were probably maybe 4 Latinx students and 1 Asian American student. I think I can specifically like that. So it's mostly an all black school, and all students of color, right? And so, I just was stunned by this idea. Well, we're and the idea was like, well, it's going to be really educational. It's going to be really important. Now, what exactly was to be learned was sort of fuzzy and undefined, right? And so all I could think about was like, all right, well, we're teachers, this is a school. So what are we teaching? What is the lesson here? And the implicit lesson is deterrence, right? The idea that you're supposed to be really scared and then you're supposed to not do crimes. And because the people who do crimes are bad people and you don't want to be like them. And I remember just thinking, and I was much younger than I am now, and there's a lot of things I didn't have language for, but I was like, I just don't think people do crimes for those reasons, right? I just don't think that's how this works. And I also don't want to take my 13 and 14-year-old students into the jail. This is a violent place. This is a place of harm. And then I also didn't want to be the disrespectful younger teacher who, this is what they do every year and this is our tradition and, so on and so forth. So I said, okay, well, how about on the same day, there's a film that came out that I think looks really great, and I'm going to do a field trip to see this film about poetry. And it's a documentary about poetry. And anybody who wants to come to the film can come to the film, and anybody who wants to go to the jail, or if their parents want that for them, they can go to the jail. And so, everybody sign up. And from any class, even if you're not in my class, just whoever, if you don't want to go on the jail field trip, you can come with Miss E to the Gene Siskel Film Center.
Providing an alternative.
Yes, providing an alternative. And so, I took them we saw the film, and it was warm in Chicago that day, and, we're riding on the school bus, and I had this one parent who was a volunteer, and he used to, on the way back on the bus, be asking kids different trivia questions, and he'd give you $1 if you, everyone's having a great time, right? And we get back to the classroom, and the other half of my class, the class that went to the jail, is not there. And it's almost dismissal time. So I'm all right, well, they'll be back soon. Everybody else, get your book bags, get your coats and stuff. And so I'm wrapping up my end of day things. And then the door opens, and I will never forget this moment. The first child who walked in and she walked up to me, and she looked so shaken. And she just walked up to me and said, I love you, Miss Ewing. Thank you for teaching me, and gave me a hug, but not in a way that made me feel good, right? She was hurt. She was hurting. And all my students who had gone on this trip kind of walked in with this really grim parade and just started silently packing up their things. And one of them was my daddy is in there, and I just don't like thinking about my daddy in that place. I just don't like thinking about it,
Oh,
and
my God.
Another one of my students who was very rambunctious, always had something to say, always had, 2 cents to put in. I just remember him sitting there and just silently packing up his stuff without speaking. And later on, I would find out that his father was serving a very, very, very long sentence in prison. And they shared the same name. So I actually found this out because I was what happened to this person? And Googled them, and then found his father's case. And it was so hurtful. It was so hurtful to them, to me, to our community. And I just didn't understand, why, just why? Why did someone think that this was a good idea, Mm-hmm. And I understand why. I understand the assumptions that went into that. And many of those assumptions were on the part of people who I can say actually loved these kids, right? But it is in the fabric of normalcy. It goes unquestioned in our social world of this country that our people need control.
Right.
Right?
Yeah. And
we
deterrence.
don't have it. And deterrence. And man, you hear that from Black parents, you hear that from Black teachers all the time. Yeah, there are so many examples. They're so awful. And I think, as with all matters of carcerality, it's not just about the obvious stuff, the metal detectors, the police in schools. Like, yeah, that stuff is bad, and we need to talk about it. It's not just about detention and suspending kids and expelling them. It's also about, as with all of carcerality, our own assumptions about punishment, about who needs and requires punishment, and about moving to punitive spaces instead of ever thinking about what else we could do.
Yeah. I asked our mutual friend, Janine Denevage.
Yay, my queen.
Question that I know, she's our queen. She is our queen. It's sweet. All three of us have distinct dynamic relationships with her.
She's brilliant.
So I asked her, like, what would you want to hear Eve answer? Because I know that she loves you, and as a sociologist is also looking at your work through a different lens. And she shared this question, which I think is so good.
It's going to be, like, so deep and smart.
It's going to go straight to the heart, right?
Okay, yeah.
So how did the history you recount in this book impact you specifically as someone who deeply identifies as a teacher of young Black people and youth generally?
Wow, thanks. Oh,
Thank
goodness.
you, Janine.
I will say that didn't go where I thought it was going to go from the first half of, like, addressing me specifically. I think that, what I mean by that is, I think that writing this book, the process of writing the book, was often really hurtful. And I would say, not only as, like, a Black person who is a teacher of Black children and Black people, but also just, like, as a Black person, as a former child, right? Like, as a, as a person who loves children. And, many of my books, much of my work is, like, injurious to me. Ghost in the Schoolyard, which is my first nonfiction book, that Janine was, like, very, like, present for the writing of. That book, the book is about the history of race and segregation in Chicago and the largest mass school closure in the history of the United States. And of which, like, this school where I taught was one of the schools that closed. And to write that book, I had to listen to, like, hours of audio of children and teachers and community members and parents being like, please don't close our school. And sometimes crying, and sometimes literally begging, and sometimes, a principal saying, like, I feel like I'm a slave on the auction block. And, like, very young children of 7 or 8 and 9, like, just crying into a microphone. Just, that was very hard. 1919, which is my book about the Red Summer, was, like, in writing that book, I learned new things about my own anxiety and my own body and the way my body responds to anxiety. And I remember being at a book festival, and I was supposed to meet up with Hanif Abdurraqib, a close friend of mine. And I was like, I have to go to the store and get Benadryl because I'm having, like, an allergic reaction, but I don't know what I'm allergic to. And my body was just breaking out in hives, like anxiety hives. So this book, I think, like, I was like, okay, what can I do to not hurt myself badly? And it was hard. I think that there's one particular story in the book that is the story of a young woman named Julia Grant. And Julia I was looking for something else in some newspaper archives, and I found this article about a young Black girl who she was arrested when she was, like, 13 or 14 for shoplifting pants from a store. Her and her friends went to several stores and they were, like, shoplifting, and specifically they were stealing pants, which I find, you can read into that what you will. So she got taken to a convict prison farm, and, she's living on this farm doing free labor for the state. And I think, something that people don't understand or maybe haven't always thought about is, like, those images of, people on the chain gang, like, tilling the land or building the putting down railroad spikes or, working in a quarry. Like, that labor built the roads that people drive, that labor, right? Like, so much of what people consider to be modernity, like, rests on the labor of those folks who were oftentimes children, like 13, 14, 15, 16-year-old children. So at some point when she was incarcerated on this farm, something caught fire and her skin was burned very badly. And so the only reason that she went into the archival record is because she got burnt so badly that doctors were looking for volunteers to do a skin graft, like a skin transplant on her. And they published all these articles in the newspaper about looking for somebody to do this. And the articles always had this air more of like scientific curiosity of like, are we going to be able to do this new technology of this skin graft? As opposed to like, who is she? What happened to her? Why was she incarcerated? How did she get burned? And ultimately, nobody volunteers and she dies. She dies in the hospital of tuberculosis. And it was one of those moments where, like, where someone is there in history talking to you and everything you want to know about them is absent, and everything that is like an artifact of the harm done against them is present, hyper-present. Yeah. So I was able to find her court paperwork. I was able to find her arrest paperwork. I was able to find a record of her living on this prison farm. I was able to find these articles about, somebody going to donate. But like how was she hurt? Like how did she feel? When was she who were her parents? Like all the things that I would want to know were gone. And for me, that was very painful because two things that are kind of threads. I write in a lot of different genres and ways of writing, but two things that are really threads in my work are I really think of archival work and reading and writing in general as communicating across time and space. And that's part of why I see it as an Afrofuturist practice, right? Like I think that when you are reading an archival document or looking at an archival thing, like someone is talking to you across space and time from the past, right?
Wow.
And you are communicating with them from the future. Like that's literally what's happening. And so to do that and to be unable to access the person's heart place is really hard. And like identifying with like this Black teen girl who did this crime and was horrifically punished and lost her life was really hard. And another kind of governing thread in my life is Gwendolyn Brooks is a very, very important writer to me. And one of her most famous poems, and the first poem of hers that I ever read, is called "We Real Cool." And it's a very short poem that I learned for the first time in like second or third grade in Chicago. And there's this amazing recording of her talking about how she was inspired to write the poem. And one of the things she says is she was passing by a pool hall in the middle of the day, and she saw these 7 kids inside playing pool. And she said, instead of asking myself, why aren't they in school? I asked myself, I wonder how they feel about themselves. And that question, I wonder how they feel about themselves, is like so much of what I'm trying to document, invite, excavate, uncover, meditate on in my work. And so, that's one example of like, I will say the book was very painful from those like kind of orientations of my identity. And also I felt that it was very important to, as all of my heroes have done, to also be using this work as part of a search for paths out, right? Like maps to new places. And that's also what I'm always looking for. And that it's important when you're documenting bad things to also say thank you to your ancestors, your political ancestors that resisted, to see their struggle, to not be ungrateful or dismissive of their struggle. Because what was it for otherwise, Anyway, that's my long answer.
No, it's a beautiful answer. And I think of this, I often think of having ancestors in the lineage of my work, and some of them are known to me and many of them are not known to me. I always imagine that there were like smart Black girls who were born when they weren't able to access education, but that didn't mean they're not part of the lineage of my work and that they weren't looking at the stars and trying to figure everything out.
Yeah, and that they're not with you. I mean, depending on your spiritual beliefs, right? That I very much believe that these people are with me, and I'm asking them for their help and grace and support as I do this work. And forgiveness if I do it wrong, and guidance on how to do it right.
Wow. Thank you for that, Eve.
Thank you. Thanks for the question.
Yeah, bringing us to, we have one more question for you, bringing us to a close. We're wondering what you're hoping people will do once they read this text. We're wondering if you think a good education is possible for anyone right now in America. You say it's not a fix your school guide, but knowing all this history does change a reader. And so we're wondering, what does your research point to in terms of how we reclaim or course correct on the way that education happens in a U.S. context, or how we even understand what the purpose of education is?
Yeah. The first part of your question that really stands out to me is the question of, is a good education possible? And the answer is that a good education is happening every day, all day, somewhere, right? And so a couple of years ago, Ta-Nehisi Coates and I co-taught this summer class of Howard students. And it was basically like writers, like Black kid writer summer camp, where we were like, we all lived together in Virginia in these like dorms. And, they would have like writing workshop with me, writing workshop with him. And then in between, I was like, we're going to learn archery. We're going to like sit around a campfire and tell scary stories. We're going to,
Oh my God. That sounds so fun. What was the age range?
So fun. They were all college. It was like 18 to 22.
Oh my God.
It was so great. Yeah, it was amazing.
I want to go to there.
I know. It was amazing. Well, also our like visiting writers were like Clint Smith, Jackie Woodson, Yona Harvey, and Hanif. It was very fun. It was a good time.
I love the idea of all of those people also doing archery together.
Yeah, no, Yona did archery with us.
That's my favorite.
I was like, Yona, do you want to do archery? And she was like, I do. In fact, I do. And by the way, if anybody who's listening has like $1 billion and wants to fund this extremely expensive endeavor that we have not repeated since then, please holler at your girl.
Right. We're looking for the billionaires out there.
Yeah,
the billionaires.
All the things I said about how there are no good billionaires. If you are the one, please forgive me and send us your money. And I won't talk about you for a period of at least 1 year. But so during that time, one of my, it was all the things like, everybody like grew so close and we taught and learned so much. And there are all these like great writer aha moments. But one of my most memorable moments was one of our students, Elijah, teaching everybody how to fish. And he was like, oh, hey, they said at the front desk of this place that they have like some fishing rods, like I'm going to fish. And this was young people from all over the U.S. and all over the diaspora. And so there are like, Ethiopian folks there and Nigerian folks there and folks from New York and folks from California. And he was like so patient and caring and encouraging. And honestly, him like seeing a young Black boy becoming a young Black man, teaching his peers how to fish with this tender attention is like my favorite teaching and learning memory of that time. And so I say that to give an example of like, if I took the question away from school and if I asked you, like, tell me about a time when you learned something very important. Tell me about the person who taught you or the moment that taught you this, right? Like, some people would tell me about a school story and a lot of people wouldn't, right? And I think that part of the radical work is, and I say like, I'm a school girly, okay? Like I believe in public schools, but at the same time, I think remembering that all of us have the capacity to teach and learn and that all of us teach and learn all the time, is actually part of the radical reconfiguration of how we change this work. Because then we start thinking, well, what do my elders have to teach me, right? Well, what do children have to teach each other? What do children have to teach adults? What can my neighbors teach me, right? And that is crucial. And it also is a practice that is rooted in love and care, right? Like it's a kind of teaching and learning that begins from love and care. And so I think that kind of good education is always already happening. Now, that said, it is then our job to say, how do we bring that in alignment with what happens in these buildings that kids are going to all the time? And here we reach a philosophical fork in the road, because there are people, including my good friend and colleague Dave Stovall, who I cite extensively on this matter in the book, who are like, this can't be fixed. Like, this can't abolish, right? Like, the system as it is built, as I have over 400 pages described here in painstaking detail, is there is no recovery there. There is no remediation there, and that it's been so poisoned by these foundations that we don't come back from that, and instead we have to figure out where else and how else education can live. Now, I am very intrigued by that idea, and also, part of my particular brand of Black feminism is very much about the provision of immediate care. And so I think about in March 2020, when people were like, we have to close the schools right now because of COVID. And a lot of people, including me, were like, okay, where will kids get food? Right. Yes. And at a time when the parts of the state that could be supportive have been so deeply eroded, and the parts of the state that are awful are so amplified, schools have remained, alongside libraries, but, one of these last kind of bastions of provision of care.
Yeah.
And unlike libraries, which I am number one library fan in the world, but schools have to take every kid. That is every kid. If a kid who does not have a safe place to sleep tonight, a kid who is undocumented and just got here, unaccompanied by any other adults, right? Like an unaccompanied minor who just got here and is seeking asylum, a kid whose parents are dealing with substance misuse issues and don't really have it together. All of those kids, school is a place where they get to show up. And in theory, there are supposed to be adults there and other peers whose job it is to take care of them and love them and nurture them, and also feed them, right? And make sure that they have, and we all have these stories of those teachers that we know or have been, where it's the teacher who made sure you had clean clothes, the teacher who made sure you had a ride home, the teacher who, right now, part of the assault of this presidential administration is attacking teachers that are protecting kids' gender autonomy and their gender identity, yes. Right? The teacher who maybe was the only person in your life that called you what you wanted to be called, right? And who recognized you for who you are. And so there's something about the universality of that I still cherish, and that is really hard for me. That is a tension that I have not at this time in my life reconciled. Mm-hmm. And so the one thing that this goes to what I hope people do when they pick up the book is that I hope that one thing that people take away, there's a lot of history, and I know people will learn new facts, but at this time, it's really important for all of us to be affirmative, proactive, and autonomous about what we think a good education looks like. And that is not only about, as we said up top, calling the legislator and going to the school board meetings and running for the school board, and writing the letter to the principal, although you should do all of those things. You should write a letter to the principal that says, what are you going to do to protect the gender nonconforming and trans kids in this school? Mm-hmm. What are you going to do to make sure that Black history is taught? What are you going to do to protect teachers that defend kids? Whether or not you feel like your kid is in any of those categories. Yes, do all those things.
Deportation.
Yes, right. What are you going to do when ICE gets here, right? And we are also teachers, and we are also keepers of space. Mm-hmm. And so what are we going to do to show up and fight for the people whose job it is to do that work officially, and also see it as our job as well? And what I hope is that people will start to think about, where is this collective political action going to happen? And it can be simple, and it can also be fun, right? It could be hey, I am worried about how Black history is going to be taught in my kid's school. And also, I think Black history is dope and fun and cool. And so, I have a friend who's a parent who many years ago he was worried about basically the Black kids at his school, not being loved, respected, or upheld. And him and all the other parents of Black children started a weekend Saturday school where yes. they were all right, this weekend we're going to learn about jazz. And by learn about jazz, I mean, we're going to put some jazz records on and we're just going to dance, right? That's cool. That's fun. Yes. I had great conversations with a friend recently who has a baby and who is a, fiercely anti-Zionist Jewish person, and thinking about where and how he's, saying, how am I going to teach my child about what Judaism means to us, right? What it means in our family. And I'm like, dude, you got to call some people, right? You got to get 2 or 3 other people that are on the same page and like cook a meal, make a craft, take a trip, Yeah. And that is not only powerful counterinsurgent work, it also like makes you happy, keeps you going, and helps you reflect on what do I think is important for kids to know? What are the 5 things that any child in my life are like? I've had this conversation with friends. I'm like, what's the non-negotiable curriculum, right? That like any child that comes your way, they need to know this thing or you have failed, right? Like who's the hip hop artist that they need to know? What is the recipe that they need to know how to cook? Or else it's like, you're going to die in shame on your deathbed, knowing that your child like couldn't play spades, couldn't make cornbread, didn't know who Outkast was, like whatever your thing is,
I definitely agree on spades.
Yeah. Autumn, I want to hear your, like, since you opened talking about parenting, if you don't mind, like, what are some of the things that are non-negotiable for you? Like, no child of mine will leave my house without knowing this or that. Any child, right? Nibbling, blah, blah, blah. So, and side note, sorry, I'm a Gemini, so I have like a side note to the side note to the side note. But I just want to say, because I just said nibbling, that my mom recently came into, like, someone taught her the word nibbling and she was excited and was trying to use it. But she's like, Eve, you care so well for your nibbles. You're so good to your nibbles.
That's good too.
I was like, hilarious. Yeah, and I couldn't, it was so good. It was so good. I couldn't say it.
Nibbling is rooted in Chicago.
Of course.
The person I learned it from was in Chicago, Tanuja.
Well, who is an amazing and very important teacher and community organizer in my own education.
I didn't know that it came from Tanuja. That's amazing.
That is not surprising.
The person who taught it to me.
That is not surprising.
I love that. Yeah.
As the community historian Dilla says here in Chicago, everything dope comes from Chicago. But Autumn, what are things that any children and nibblings in your world, like, you failed if they don't know?
Yeah, I would say, spades being one of them, actually. Like, all of my children know how to play spades. Not amazing. They don't all enjoy it, but they do all know how.
Sure.
I would say how to cook fried chicken well feels like a really important, Yes. And again, it's complicated because one of my kids is a vegetarian, but she's not the kind of vegetarian who's unwilling to learn how to prepare meat,
Okay, that's great. She could also be the person who makes the great deep fried little cauliflower bites.
Exactly. Like there's, there's things. And then on the music front, it's been kind of a moving target for me. There was something that happened recently where, because there are great Black artists that I feel like I have done a really good job of like imparting the music tradition to my kids. But there was someone recently, oh my God, I'm blanking on it right now. But there was someone recently where the question came up, who is this person? And my kids were like, we have no idea. And I was like, I literally
I hope it wasn't Prince, because it wasn't Prince.
Okay, Prince. Good. Fortunately, my kids definitely
Minneapolis card revoked.
Yeah, exactly. No, it wasn't Prince, but it was someone. I feel like it was someone in that realm.
It was Prince level.
It was Prince. It felt like it to me, which I'm a Sagittarius, so I can be quite dramatic, and so. So it might have just me being internally dramatic, and I did keep it internal for the most part. My face probably showed something, but I definitely had a moment where I was like, I did something wrong, clearly, if my kids, maybe it was like Lauryn Hill, or it was something where I was
But what an opportunity. What an opportunity for a new learning. Yes.
So there was definitely a moment recently of like putting doo-wop on in the car. And then just like helping my kids connect the dots between like SZA and Lauryn Hill. You know what I mean?
Okay, you have a whole curriculum here.
Fugees or something. It was like
it was just like you guys need to know about this part of Black women in music specifically. Right. Like you need to understand the relationship. Yeah. I know we have to close out, but I just want to say that the last thing that you shared helped me make a connection around schools as one of the few places in our society where children have rights.
Yes.
That the society has to legally protect, which I think, it's one of those things where you're like, I know this, but you helped me think about it in a really different way. So I really appreciate that.
Yeah. And I mean, we know now all the limitations of the rights framework in the state and looking to the state to say, and
Totally.
all of that.
All of that.
And also, I think that it matters. It's
It really matters.
It's worth paying attention to. It's worth paying attention to.
Wow.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
I know this has been awesome. I feel like I really hope that everyone runs out and picks
you.
up this book, uses it, and then forms these networks of education amongst your community, your friends, your family that are able to look at this history and say and understand like the system is not going to provide what our babies need, even though it can take care of some of those fundamental provisional needs. But there's something else that we need to also make sure that we're providing. Do you think we have time for one top culture thing from everyone?
I don't think that. Well, maybe we could each say something like one
Mine
sentence.
is fast.
One sentence.
Okay.
Okay.
My best friend Nate
first.
loves wrestling, and this last weekend I watched the Royal Rumble with him after not watching any wrestling for like a really long time, and he gave like dissertation level footnotes and annotations on everything that occurred in the Royal Rumble, and it was really fun. It's straight man drag, as he calls it.
That's actually really straight man drag. It is that. Straight men and leotards and drag. Autumn, what about for you?
My top culture is my dojo, East Lake Aikido, puts out a journal every year of writings, reflections, poetry, essays, things that either come from people that we're in a lineage of or comes from our own students and teachers in our dojo reflecting on our practice, our martial arts practice. And I was just reading it recently, and I just think my practice partners are top.
Oh, I love that. And can we get a hold of that journal?
I don't know.
It's secret.
I think it's like
secret
it's really
knowledge.
Well, I mean, you'd have to go to the dojo to like get it. It's like a very, very bespoke item.
I love that.
It's a bespoke item of top culture. Yeah.
I love it. Mine is also quick. I just wanted to say for people, so I watched the Grammys. I wasn't planning to watch them because I've been so disappointed by award shows for like 20 years. But my sweetheart was like, I think we should just like put it on and just see. And it was outstanding. Like outstanding performances, outstanding hosting, outstanding politic. I was so proud. Like so many people used their moment in the spotlight to protect trans people, protect immigrant people, protect DEI, protect, like just stand up and be like, that's not who we are. And it felt like in some ways the Grammy was planting the first seeds of secession. Like it was like, we're over here doing this and we're going to continue and protect it. And y'all are over here doing something else. So I recommend people go back and watch it if you're normally someone who skips the awards, not just for Beyonce doing her thing, but the Beyonce moment was really sweet though. Tons of people weeping in the audience and like for her, it was really beautiful. And everyone should be checking out Unrivaled, which is the new 3-on-3 basketball league for women.
Oh yeah, I'm excited about that.
I had to do too, but I put it in one sentence. I said and.
It was like a paragraph level sentence, but okay.
Look, Baldwin did it, and we love him. Okay, now let's do our closing credits.
Here we go. Thanks for listening to our show. We're on Instagram at UnderTheWorldPC.
You can make a sustaining donation to our show by visiting our page at patreon.com/IntoTheWorldShow, where we definitely are.
Another incredible thing you can do to help our show sustain itself is to write us a review on Apple Podcasts if you're an iPhone person. And this helps people looking for good new content to find us. Thank you.
How to Survive the End of the World is produced and edited by the outstanding Zach Rosen. And the transcripts are in our show notes and on our website, IntoTheWorldShow.org.
Music for today's show comes from Autumn, the band, Tunde Alaniran, Mother Cyborg, and the Bangsons.
We are done.
Okay, cool. Bye.
Bye.
Cool. Bye.